Okay, so we're recording now. So anyway, the Nazarene Acts of the Apostles. The official name of it is the Clementine Recognitions, although you usually see it referred to as the Pseudo-Clementine Recognitions, or you can sometimes they'll just call it the Pseudo-Clementine Works, and it's actually one half of a two-part document. There's the Clementine Recognitions and the Clementine Homilies, and basically what they are is just two different versions of the same story. You know, for comparative purposes, it would be like the book of Matthew and the book of Mark. You know, they're basically the same story. One of Matthew has some things that Mark doesn't have. Mark has some things that Matthew doesn't have, but for the most part, they follow the same timeline and the same narrative. And it's the same way with the homilies and the Nazarene Acts or the Recognitions. It's two different versions of the same narrative. There are some things that the homilies have that the Recognitions doesn't have, and vice versa. But both of these books were essentially buried in a collection of writings known as the Ante-Nicene Fathers. And you can Google the Ante-Nicene Fathers. You'll find it. It's a 10-volume set. Looks similar to like an old encyclopedia. And volume 8 is the volume that has all the writings from Clement. So Clement is Clement of Rome. He basically, in the beginning of the Nazarene Acts, he is in Rome and he is contemplating the meaning of life. So he's thinking, when we die, do we have an afterlife? Do we just die and then there's nothing else? Do we get judged according to our works? Or is this life the only life we have? That sort of thing. So he's wondering about this. He's contemplating this, and then he just happens to hear Barnabas teaching. So he's just he hears Barnabas in Rome teaching about the coming of Mashiach, and when he hears this, he's extremely interested in it, and so he stops what he's doing. He goes out to listen, and so right from the start, the Nazarene Acts is setting the stage for, without even mentioning his name throughout the entire work, it is essentially a speaking against Paul's doctrine and against Paul's methods. So from the very beginning, while Barnabas is out there preaching, there's these men in Rome who are attempting to debate with him, and it says that when they're debating, they're not trying to ascertain the truth. What they're trying to do is they're trying to come up with these complicated arguments to try and trip him up. They're trying to show themselves to be a better debater than Barnabas, and Barnabas is essentially just not going for it. Like, he's just not going to get distracted by it. And so one of the things that we know about Paul, there's a lot of people now in the Hebraic Roots movement that are trying to paint Paul as being this Jewish rabbi. Paul claims to be a Pharisee who was raised at the feet of Gamaliel, but throughout Paul's writings, he doesn't use rabbinic style writing. He never quotes a rabbi. He never, he doesn't even quote Yeshua at any time. There's a couple of times that he may paraphrase Yeshua, but he never actually quotes him. He just, some more scholarly people who spend their lives studying Paul have theorized that Paul knew very little about Yeshua because he never quoted him. He never, spoke the words that he used. And what he did was he made extensive use of Greco-Roman rhetorical styles of argument. One of the dialectics he used was something called thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And so this is a style of debate where you present, your argument, and then you present the other side's argument, and then you will go in and the synthesis is your final point of what you want the solution to this debate to be. And it's also referred to as strophe, antistrophe, and strophe, antistrophe, and epode or epod. So it's a Greco-Roman style of argument, and that's why Paul's letters are so confusing to people. Because what he does is he'll present his argument, then he goes into the counter argument, and then he comes back with his original argument again, and he weaves this style of writing that it'll make your head spin, and you actually have to sit there and break down everything he's saying, and he's very long-winded in his writings, and his writings can be very confusing, and that's why a lot of people now in the Hebraic Roots movement are able to make Paul out to be the Torah observant rabbi, because what they're doing is they're taking the antithesis. So he gives his thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and they're taking his antithesis and they're saying, well, see, right here he's saying that the Torah is good, or he's saying that that we need to uphold the Torah or whatever, but they ignore the other verses that are on either side of it that say the exact opposite thing. So throughout the opening chapters of the Nazarene Acts, and the Nazarene Acts is 10 books. Each chapter is basically a paragraph. But just tonight, I was just going to stick to book 1 and go through and hit some of the high points. So Barnabas is in Rome. Clement is witnessing these Greco-Roman rhetorical speakers who are attempting to tie him up in a debate, and he's not going for their arguments. And the thing that Clement keeps saying about Barnabas is that his teaching is very simple. He's not trying to weave some complicated theology. He's giving you very simple answers and very simple speech. And a lot of people were disregarding him because his theology was so simple that they were used to these really complicated arguments that were hard to understand. And as I read this, and the same thing kept coming up through the opening chapters of the book, that it becomes apparent that there was a point that they were trying to make, and I think that the point they're trying to make is that this is kind of like a sideways criticism of Paul. Is when we say that Paul's stuff is hard to understand, that this is essentially the antithesis to what Paul does. Like, this is very simple. And that's the thing about Peter's teaching. Peter's preaching throughout this entire book is the opposite of Paul. Whereas Paul never quotes Yeshua, Kepha constantly quotes him. So just about every point that Kepha makes in this, the majority of the book is a debate between Peter and Simon Magus. And Simon Magus is essentially a stand-in for Paul. But every argument that Kepha makes, at some point he quotes Yeshua. He says, for instance, the Master said this, which means, and then he would go into his explanation. But everything that Kepha did, everything that he says, he relates back to, he got that straight out of the mouth of the Master. He got it straight from Yeshua. It's very different than what you see with Paul. Now there's later in the first book, Kepha, Clement goes to Israel, and in Caesarea he runs into Kepha, and so from about the 10th chapter on, Kepha and Barnabas, or Kepha and Clement, are teamed up together. And Clement becomes Kepha's scribe. And his mission from James is, from James the brother of Yeshua, is that he is to be, to write down everything that Kepha says, and whenever he gets a scroll, he is to send the scroll back to James, and James is keeping these scrolls. So, as you read the Nazarene Acts, at times you'll forget that basically what you're reading is an extremely long letter, and usually toward the end of each book, he'll start speaking to James and say, he'll refer back to other things he said. So it reads like a novel, but it is essentially it's a letter. Kepha also, we have this episode in Galatians where there's this disagreement between Kepha and Paul. The story, of course, that we get in Galatians is only from Paul's side of the story. And what he says is that, when Kepha was sitting with the Gentiles eating, and then these people came from James, and when these guys from James came around, then Kepha withdrew himself and would no longer eat with the Gentiles. Now, the thing that everyone misses in that story is that Paul himself admits that when Kepha withdrew, and he says, I withstood Kepha to his face, it says that everybody went over to Kepha's side. So we don't really know, we don't know exactly what happened. But what we do know is that when the argument ensued, it was everyone else against Paul. And so whereas Paul paints this picture in Galatians that he rebuked Peter, if you read what's actually written by Paul, it sounds more like Paul was the one that got rebuked. So in the Nazarene Acts, Kepha is talking about this issue about eating with Gentiles. And he says that for the first week or so that Clement is with him, Kepha will not eat with Clement. So, Kepha's got his 12 disciples, of which Clement is one of them. But Kepha and his 11, who have been with him longer, when it's time to eat, they'll withdraw over to one area, and then Clement will eat, either by himself or with the other Gentiles who have not been baptized yet. But then once Clement gets baptized, then he comes in and has table fellowship with Kepha. But he says that, but he explains to Clement on the first night. He comes to him and says, "Look, Clement, I don't want you to be upset because, I'm not withdrawing from you because I don't like you, or it's not because, I think I'm better than you or something like that. The reason is because anyone that has ever eaten any unclean meat or eaten anything sacrificed to an idol is not without an unclean spirit. And until you have fasted for 3 days, been baptized, and brought into Messiah, when you're baptized, it will force out any evil spirit in you. You will be made clean. All your sins are forgiven. But until that happens, I have no way of knowing if you've got an unclean spirit, because they will get inside of you. They will hide, conceal themselves, and when I sit down to table fellowship with you, I'm essentially opening myself up to an attack by an unclean spirit that may be within you." And this issue comes up several times where they have this discussion, and it's quite a bit different than what you hear, from Paul, because Paul's the one who says that, look, if somebody gives you something to eat, just don't ask any questions. If it was sacrificed to an idol, as long as you don't know that it was sacrificed to an idol, don't worry about it. Just eat it. Whereas the picture you get from Kepha is that that's essentially playing Russian roulette. You don't know if you shouldn't ever eat anything that you don't know whether it was sacrificed to an idol or not, because if it is, then that unclean meat, or that meat, has got a demonic entity attached to it, and when you eat it, you're bringing that into yourself. And what did we see Yeshua do whenever he cast Legion out of that man, and Legion asked to go into the herd of swine? So you got this unclean meat that Yeshua is casting these demons into. So according to Kepha, and honestly, if you ever go to the church, if they talk about any kind of like demonology at all, it's always from this point of view that, okay, well, I've been baptized, I've said the sinner's prayer, I invited, in their words, I've invited Jesus into my heart, so therefore, the demons have no power over me. Like, it's almost like they think they have this, Jesus force field around them as protecting them from any kind of unclean spirits. But we see in the New Testament, we see these crowds of people coming to Yeshua who had unclean spirits, who believed in him, and yet they still had these unclean spirits until it was Yeshua personally who cast them out. So, and Keith saying, he's saying, look, it's the same concept of not, you don't, try the Lord. You don't tempt, the Father. You're not going to set yourself up. It's like jumping off of a building. If you're sitting down with someone who has an unclean spirit and keeping table fellowship with that person, you're opening yourself up. And it's the same thing with unclean meat. That if you're eating unclean meat, if you're eating pork or shellfish or anything like that, you're opening yourself up to these unclean spirits that will attach themselves to this meat. But the part that I really want to get to is that there is another version of the story of the attack by Paul on the apostles that we read about in the book of Acts. And it's where they go up to the temple to debate with the chief priests. And so, this is something that I know Jackson's went over this before, but this is something that I've been getting a lot of questions about lately. And I guess, it's a good idea to sometimes kind of go back and review things, because we always have new people coming into the assembly. And so, the Nazarene Acts of the Apostles, or the Recognitions of Clement, it may actually be one of Luke's sources when he wrote the book of Acts. Now, in Luke 1:1, the first chapter of Luke, he actually admits that he's putting together this testimony that he's sending to Theophilus from accounts of other people. He's getting sources together, and he's using the sources to put together his testimony of what occurred. And he says, from Luke 1:1, it says, "Since many have indeed taken in hand to set in order an account of the matters completely confirmed among us, as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word delivered them to us." So, Luke, right here, he's admitting that he was not an eyewitness, that it was eyewitnesses that delivered the word to us, or to Luke and the other disciples. It says, "It seemed good to me as well, having followed up all these matters exactly from the beginning, to write to you an orderly account, O most excellent Theophilus, that you might know the certainty of the words to which you were taught." And he gives a similar introduction in Acts 1:1. It says, "The first account I made, O Theophilus, of all that Yeshua began both to do and to teach, until the day when he was taken up, after giving instructions through the set-apart Spirit to the emissaries whom he had chosen, to whom he also presented himself alive after suffering by many infallible proofs, being seen by them for 40 days, speaking concerning the reign of Elohim." So, Luke is admitting right from the beginning that he was not an eyewitness to the early events. And so scholars who textual critics who study these texts, they will tell you that the first half of Acts, the author always refers to the people in the narrative. He says that they did this, he said this, she said that, but it's always third person. But then about halfway through the book of Acts, it goes from being they did this to we did this. We went to this place, we witnessed this, or whatever. So in the same way that Luke put together the book of Luke from other sources, other eyewitnesses, we can presume from the evidence in the text that he did the same thing with the book of Acts, at least at the beginning of it. And so he admits that he has sources, and I believe that the Nazarene Acts may be one of those sources. So if you have a copy of the Recognitions, you can turn to Book 1, Chapter 43, and it's where they are beginning to Kepha is introducing the story of what happened when they were debating with the high priest. He says, "Nevertheless, the truth everywhere prevailed, for in proof that these things were done by divine power, we who had been very few became over the course of days by the help of Yeshua far more than they, so that the Kohanim at one time were afraid lest it be that by the providence of Yeshua to their confusion the whole of the people should come over to our faith. Therefore they often sent to us and asked us to discourse to them concerning Yeshua, whether he was the Navi, or the prophet, whom Moshe foretold, who is the ageless Mashiach. For on this point only does there seem to be any difference between us who believe in Yeshua and the unbelieving Yahudim." So, from the introduction where Keith is first, telling this event to Clement, he's pointing out that many people were coming over to their faith. The priests were concerned about everyone coming over to their faith, and but they were actually wanting to the Nazarenes to come in and speak to them about Yeshua because they wanted to know if he actually was the Messiah. This is similar to what we're going to read in a few minutes in the book of Acts. The major difference is that in the book of Acts, they also speak about the priests being concerned because everybody's coming over to them, but rather than asking for a debate and a discourse about it, the priests are trying to arrest them. And in the same chapter it says, "But when they often made such requests to us and sought for a fitting opportunity, a week of years was completed from the passion of Yeshua. The kahal of Yahuwah that was constituted in Jerusalem was the most plentiful. It multiplied and grew, being governed with most righteous ordinances by Yaakov, who was ordained mavaker in it by the master." So, in this chapter, you have a very important piece of information, and that is that the head of the early assembly was not Kepha, it was actually James. This is also, you can also see this in the book of Acts in the Bible, and also in Paul's letters. He mentions James as being the head of the assembly. You know, when people come from the Jerusalem assembly, it's always people coming from James, and that was because James was the mavaker. So, contrary to what the church always teaches us, that it was Peter. The Catholic Church says Peter was the first pope, and when in reality the evidence is that it was actually James who was the first head of the assembly. He was in a later letter that is in the appendix to the Nazarene Acts. Clement calls James the mavaker of mavakers. And according to the Nazarene Acts, it says that he was ordained mavaker by the master, or by the Lord. And I don't think it's speaking about Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, it's speaking about Yeshua, that Yeshua was the one who named him the mavaker. And we see that in the Gospel of Thomas, where it says in Thomas, verse 12, it says, "The disciples said to Yeshua, 'We know that you're going to leave us. Who will be our leader?' And Yeshua says to them, 'No matter where you are to go to James the Just, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being.'" So we see, according to the witness in the Gospel of Thomas, it was Yeshua himself that named named James the mavaker. Rush, are you asking what chapter of the Nazarene Acts? We're in chapter 43. And after that, after chapter 43, Kepha goes into an explanation about what exactly Mashiach is. He goes into some brief history of like Moses and the way that Moses foretold Yeshua and such and so forth. But if we skip down to chapter 55, he gets back to the story about the debate with the high priests. So chapter 55, it says, "When the Kohen HaGadol had often sent Kohanim to ask us that we might discourse with one another concerning Yeshua, when it seemed a fit opportunity and it pleased all the Kahal, we went up to the temple, and standing on the steps together with our faithful brothers, the people kept perfect silence. And first the Kohen HaGadol, the high priest, began to exhort the people that they should hear patiently and quietly, and at the same time witness and judge of those things that were to be spoken." So this is what I mentioned earlier. It's a different story than what we have in Acts, but it's following a similar narrative. The big difference is that you don't have the high priest, beating the apostles and arresting them and throwing them into prison. You have this debate between the Nazarene assembly and the high priests, and so it goes through several debates back and forth of different members of different apostles coming up and debating. Eventually, it becomes Kepha's turn to debate with Caiaphas. So Caiaphas, he says that Caiaphas again. Now this is chapter 62. I'm trying to remember my Roman numerals. It says, "Caiaphas again looking at me, and sometimes in the way of warning, and sometimes in that of accusation, said that I ought for the future to refrain from preaching Mashiach, Yeshua, lest I should do it to my own destruction, and lest being deceived myself, I should also deceive others. Then, moreover, he charged me with presumption, because though I was unlearned, a fisherman and a rustic, I dared to assume the office of a teacher." So you have Kepha being given a reprimand by the high priest. He's essentially being warned by the high priest that he needs to not be teaching about Yeshua. Kepha then refutes the accusation from the high priest. He says, "When I had thus spoken, the whole multitude of the Kohanim was in a rage because I had foretold them to overthrow the temple." Let me actually get to the text. I'm following a presentation I got set out, but I want to see what Kepha actually said. Okay, so here's Kepha's reply. He says, "And after he spoke these things and many more of the same kind, I said in reply that I incurred less danger if, as he said, this Yeshua were not the Mashiach, because I received him as a teacher of Torah, that he was in terrible danger, he being the high priest was in terrible danger, if this be the very Mashiach, as assuredly he is, for I believe in him who has appeared, and for whom else, who has never appeared, does he reserve his faith." So he's saying, look, I'm saying I believe in someone who actually appeared. Who are you saving your faith for that you've never seen? He says, "But I'm an unlearned and uneducated man, as you say, a fisherman and a rustic, and I have more understanding than wise Zachanim. Thus said I, ought the more to strike terror into you. For if I disputed without any learning and won over you wise and learned men, it would appear that I had acquired this power by long learning, and not by the favor of divine power. But now when, as I've said, we unskilled men convince and overcome you with wise men, who that has any sense does not perceive that this is not a work of human refinement, but a divine will and gift." It says, "And then we argued and bore witness, and we were unlearned men and fishermen, and we taught the Kohanim concerning the unified Yahuwah of the heavens, the Zachanim concerning the resurrection of the dead, the Shomerim concerning the sacredness of Yerushalayim, the Sophrim and the Pruashim concerning the Malkuth Shamayim, the Talmud of Yochanan, that they should not allow Yochanan to be a stumbling block to them, and to the people that Yeshua was the ageless Mashiach." So that's what it was that got the high priest so wound up, was that Kepha essentially turned his argument back upon him and says, look, if you're going to say that, I'm on page 50 in the translation. Dwayne. So, so this is essentially what put these the high priests into such a tizzy, was that, here's Kepha, who is this, fisherman from the country that's coming in here and teaching them and debating against them. So, page 51, chapter 65. It says, "When I had thus spoken, the whole multitude of the Kohanim was in a rage, because I had foretold to them the overthrow of the Hekel. Because Gamaliel, who was secretly our brother in the faith, but by our advice remained among them, saw that they were greatly enraged, and moved with intense fury against us. He stood up and said, 'Be quiet for a little, O men of Israel, for you do not perceive that the trial hangs over you. So refrain from these men. If what they are engaged in be of human counsel, it will soon come to an end. But if it be from Yahuwah, why will you sin without cause and prevail nothing?'" So this sounds kind of similar to what Gamaliel was saying in the book of Acts. He goes on to say, "But who can overpower the will of Yahuwah? Now therefore, since the day is declining toward evening, I will myself dispute with these men tomorrow. It is in the same place, in your hearing, so that I may openly oppose and clearly confute every error." By this speech of his, their fury was somewhat checked, especially in the hope that the next day we should be publicly convicted of error, and so he dismissed the people peacefully. Okay, so we're going to skip down a little ways, but essentially the apostles come back for a week every day. They're debating in the temple, and after 7 days, James, he's there on the temple steps debating against the Kohanim. He's on the verge of winning over the debate, and then that's when essentially Paul shows up. It says that, and when matters, this is page 53, chapter 70. "And when matters were at the point that they should come and be immersed," they being the priests and the people that were gathered, it says, "Someone of our enemies, entering into the Hekel with a few men, began to cry out and to say, 'What mean you, O men of Israel? Why are you so easily hurried on? Why are you led headlong by most miserable men, who are deceived by Shimon, a magician?'" While he was thus speaking and adding more to the same effect, and while Yaakov the Mavaker was refuting him, he began to excite the people and to raise a tumult, so that the people might not be able to hear what was said. Therefore he began to drive all into confusion with shouting, and to undo what had been arranged with much labor, and at the same time to reproach the Kohanim, and to enrage them with revilings and abuse, and like a madman to excite everyone to murder, saying, "What do you? Why do you hesitate, O sluggish and inert? Why do we not lay hands upon them, and pull all these fellows to pieces?" And when he had said this, he first, seizing a strong brand from the altar, set the example of smiting. And then the others also, seeing him, were carried away with like readiness. They ensued a tumult on either side of the beating and the beaten. Much blood is shed. There is a confused flight, in the midst of which the enemy attacked Yaakov and threw him headlong from the top of the steps, and supposing him to be dead, he cared not to inflict further violence upon him. So, at this point was when, in the book of Acts, rather than the attack on James, it gives you the story of Stephen, where Stephen was stoned. But continue on in chapter 71, it says, "But our Havarim lifted James up, for they had were both more numerous and more powerful than the others. But from the fear of Yahuwah, they rather suffered themselves to be killed by an inferior force than that they would kill others. But when the evening came, the Kohanim shut up the temple, and we returned to the house of Yaakov and spent the night there in prayer. Then before daylight we went down to Jericho to the number of 5,000 men." So 5,000 men, I believe it's actually also another reference to what they said in Acts. In Acts chapter, I believe it's Acts chapter 3, mentions that they had 5,000 men that had come over to their faith at that time. So you're seeing a lot of similarities between this and Acts. It says, "Then after 3 days, one of the brothers came to us from Gamaliel, whom we mentioned before, bringing us secret tidings that the enemy had received a commission from Caiaphas, the Kohen Haggadah, that he should arrest all who believed in Yeshua and should go to Damascus with his letters, and that there also, employing the help of the unbelievers, he should make havoc upon the faithful, and that he was hastening to Damascus chiefly on this account, because he believed that Kepha had fled thither." So, if there was any doubt that this mysterious enemy that showed up in the temple was Paul, this in itself is kind of the clincher, because this is exactly what the book of Acts says about Paul. Paul received these letters from the high priest. He went after the assembly heading to Damascus, and that he was going to persecute the assembly. Also, it's worth noting here that Paul, he claims to be a Pharisee, but yet he's working as an agent of this high priest. The high priest, of course, is a Sadducee. And this is also what we hear in the references we have from like Epiphanius, is that the Ebionites believed that Paul was not even a Jew, that he was actually a Gentile who had converted to Judaism because he hoped to marry the high priest's daughter. It says about 30 days thereafter, this is still chapter 71, he stopped on his way while passing through Jericho, going to Damascus, and at that time we were absent, having gone out to the sepulchres of 2 brothers that were whitened of themselves every year, by which miracle the fury of many against us was restrained, because they saw that our brothers were held in remembrance before Yahuwah. Now, these they're going out to see these graves near Jericho and Damascus. Dr. Robert Eisman, he believes that this was actually, they went out to Qumran. That it's in the correct area. There is a graveyard out near Qumran that has been excavated, and so there's a theory out there that this is actually where they went to. That the sect at Qumran was the early believers in James. Allison, he is. The evidence also shows that Paul was a member of the Herodian family. He actually admits that at the end of the book of Romans. He says to give my regards to the house of Aristobulus, and say hi to Herodian. To paraphrase what he says there, we know who Aristobulus was that Paul was speaking to, and at that time, Aristobulus did have a son named Herod. He's known in history as Herod of Chalcis. I guess it's Chalcis. It's Chalcis, I believe. But he would have been just a small boy at that time, and Herodian itself means the little Herod. So it would be like an endearing type of title that you would call a little child. Say hello to little Billy for me, basically. So Paul is saying, say hello to little Herod. Little Herod would have been the son of Aristobulus, who he's referring to, and then Paul says, say hello to Herodian, my relative or my cousin. So he's admitting right there that he was actually a descendant of Herod. And Robert Eisman has pretty much mapped out Paul's family tree. And Josephus also refers to Paul as being a stepbrother of Agrippa. And that would explain why in the book of Acts we see Paul being taken into the palace of Agrippa. The book of Acts says that Paul was arrested and put there, but essentially he was basically in protective custody. So it kind of makes you wonder, why is it that you have people like James who lived out their entire life in Jerusalem, and he had no problems. There was no people. The common people were not looking to kill James, but it was the common people that were looking to kill Paul. James was killed in 62 by the establishment, by the religious establishment, but yet we see the religious and political establishment protecting Paul. So if you look at these two men and you look at who is protecting them and who is against them, who it is that wants to kill James and Paul, they're exact opposites. So Paul being a Herodian, member of the royal family. Josephus says the woman that Eisman believes is Paul's mother, Josephus refers to as like the richest woman in Jerusalem, or something to that effect. So, Paul was a very different picture than what we see of James, who, lived in poverty that, willingly, that he chose for himself. So, yeah, Allison, her comment is, it's amazing how the Romans seem to come to Paul's rescue. And that's correct. I mean, in fact, if there's an extra chapter of Acts, an apocryphal chapter, but it actually has Paul going up to the British Isles and into Gaul, which is France. But he goes up into this northern Europe with a whole legion of Roman soldiers to preach the gospel. So how does that happen? If Paul really is this poor guy who's just walking around in rags preaching the gospel, it doesn't make sense. Right? It sounds like a typical political tour. So what I was trying to say earlier is I think that this is probably the original source of this part of Acts. But obviously, it would appear that things were changed to cover over the embarrassment that the author had with regards to Paul attacking James. So where you did have the event where James was attacked, it's changed to where Stephen was attacked. And Paul, instead of being the one doing the attacking, now he's just standing by watching over the garments of the men who were stoning Stephen. Which that in itself is kind of odd, because when someone is being stoned, the person being stoned is the one that's stripped naked and stoned, according to the Talmud. The stoners don't take their clothes off to stone somebody. So moving on, this is chapter 73. Kepha is then sent to Caesarea to stop Simon Magus. It says, when I had entered the city, our most beloved brother Zacchaeus met me and embraced me, brought me to his lodging, in which he himself stayed, inquiring of me concerning each of the brothers, especially concerning our honorable brother Yaakov. And when I told him that he was still lame on one foot, he immediately asked the cause of this. And I related to him, this is Kepha speaking, he says, I related to him all that have now detailed to you, Clement, how we had been called by the Kohanim and Caiaphas, the Kohen Hagadol, to the Hekel, and how Yaakov the Mavaker, standing on top of the steps, had for 7 successive days shown the whole people from the scriptures of Yahuwah that Yeshua is Mashiach, and how, when all were acquiescing that they should be immersed by him in the name of Yeshua, an enemy did all these things that I have already mentioned and that I need not repeat. So again, you see this, Paul's never mentioned by name, but he's just referred to as an enemy or the enemy. Or in a letter from Peter to James, we have Peter referring to this mysterious person who Peter calls the man who is my enemy, who's essentially leading the Gentiles astray by teaching a Torah-less message. Again, it kind of fits this description of Paul. So here we have this story of the attack, and so this letter from Peter to James, it says, it's in the appendix of the Nazarene Acts. If somebody wants to put the page number up there, I don't have it in front of me. I've just got notes that I printed off. But the letter's in the appendix. It says, Kepha to Yaakov, the master and mavaker of the devoted congregation under the Father of all, through Yeshua Mashiach, wishes shalom always. So right here in the introduction, Kepha is referring to Yaakov as the master and mavaker of the devoted congregation under the Father of all. So it kind of proves incorrect this whole story that we've had passed on from the Catholic Church, that Kepha was the head of the first assembly, because Kepha himself is saying no. He's given that title to James. He says, "Knowing, my brother, that your eager desire after that which is for the advantage of us all, I beg and beseech you not to communicate to any one of the Goyim the scrolls of my preachings which I have sent to you, nor to any one of our own tribe before trial. But if anyone has proved and been found worthy, then to commit them to him, and the manner in which Moshe delivered his scrolls to the 70 who succeeded his chair, wherefore also the fruit of that caution appears even till now. For his countrymen keep the same rule of monarchy and polity everywhere, being unable in any way to think otherwise, or to be led out of the way by the much indicating Scriptures. For according to the rule delivered to them, they endeavor to correct the discordances of the Scriptures. If anyone, not being blessed to know the traditions, is confounded at the various utterances of the Navaim, wherefore they charge that no one to teach unless he has first learned how the Scriptures must be used, and thus they have among them one Elohim, one Torah, and one hope." So, and yeah, that's right, Allison. There is Stephen. His prayer right before he's stoned is almost exactly what James says right before his death. But in the opening part of this letter, Kepha, he's laying out the purpose of his letter right off the bat. He's saying to James that he's like, look, I want to be sure that you don't, these scrolls that I'm sending to you of my teachings, please don't share them with anyone, whether it's a Jew or a Gentile, until they've been proven worthy. And in fact, James goes on later to, when he makes his decision, according to Clement, James decides that for 6 years, it's 6 years before that Kepha's letters will be shared, because there are people out there that are mishandling and misusing Kepha's teachings. And so in the early assembly, James kept Kepha's teachings locked up, and the only way you could have access to it would be after 6 years of being proved in the assembly. Then you would be given access to him. So whenever I mentioned earlier, and I think I mentioned it before the recording, when I was a child and I was going through, religious school, I always wondered why it was we had hardly anything from Kepha. We had 2 letters from Peter, and that was it. And I think that the reason is because the majority of the material that Peter had written was not shared with the general body. Going on to the next chapter, it says, "In order, therefore, that the like may also be to those among us, to these 70, give the scrolls of my preachings to our brethren, with the like mystery of initiation, that they may indoctrinate those who wish to take part in the teaching." So, he uses this word indoctrinate, and it's something we usually think of as a negative thing. I don't think that Keith is necessarily using it negatively here. He's just saying, look, we can't share this information until the people understand the basic things. If you don't understand my basic teachings, you can't understand some of the things that I talk about. For if it be not done, our word of truth will be rent into many opinions, like 40,000 denominations. And this I know, not being a Navi, but as already seen the beginning of this very evil. For some from among the Goyim have rejected my Torah-observant preaching, and attaching themselves to certain Torahless and trifling preaching of the man who is my enemy. So you see the same cognomen that was used to refer to Paul being applied to this person who is taking Kepha's teachings and turning them into a Torahless and trifling type of preaching. And Kepha goes on to say, "In these things some have attempted while I'm still alive to transform my words by certain various interpretations in order to bring about the dissolution of the Torah, as though I also myself were ever of such a mind. But I didn't freely proclaim it, which Yahuwah forbid. For such a thing were to act in opposition to the Torah of Yahuwah, which was spoken by Moshe, and was borne witness to by our Master in respect of the ageless continuance. For thus he spoke, the skies and the earth shall not pass away, but one jot or tittle shall no wise pass from the Torah." So Keith is saying, look, if they're trying to do this stuff when I'm alive, imagine what they're going to do after I'm gone. They're trying to say that even though I never preached against the Torah, I somehow had it in my mind to do it. I just never said it out loud. And this he said, that all things might come to pass, speaking about Yeshua. But these men, professing I know not how to know my mind, undertake to explain my words, which they have heard of me more intelligently than I who spoke them, telling their Talmudim that this is my meaning, which indeed I never thought of. But if, while I'm still alive, they dare thus to misrepresent me, how much more will those who shall come after me dare to do so? And that brings us to where we are today. So, Kepha knew right off the bat that this sort of thing was going on. So, they took steps to protect his teachings, but he could already see what was happening. He says, "Therefore, that no such thing may be done for this, as I have prayed and besought you not to communicate the scrolls of my preaching that I have sent to you to anyone, whether of our own tribe or another tribe, before trial. But if anyone, having been tested, has been found worthy, then to hand them over to him according to the initiation of Moses, by which he delivered his scrolls to the 70 who succeeded his chair, in order that they may thus keep the faith and everywhere deliver the rule of truth, explaining all things after our tradition, lest being themselves dragged down by ignorance, being drawn into error by the conjectures after their mind, they bring others into the like pit of destruction. Now the things that seem good to me I have fairly pointed out to you, and what seems good to you, do it. Do you, my master, becomingly perform farewell." So, so that was Kepha's letter to James. And so, okay, well, how does all this fit into Acts? That's basically what the point of all this is. So, if you have your Bible, you can turn to Acts 5:12, and it says that, "And through the hands of the emissaries, many signs and wonders were done among the people, and they were all with one mind on Solomon's porch," which, of course, was in the temple. It says, "But of the rest, no one had the courage to join them. However, the people made much of them, and more believers were added to the master, large numbers, both men and women." So, here we have, it's basically similar language as to what Kepha said when he introduced this whole purpose of the debate. In the Nazarene Acts, it says that many people were adding to their number, men and women. It says the same thing here in Acts. It says, "So they brought the sick out into the streets and laid them on beds and couches, that at least the shadow of Kepha passing by might fall on some of them. A large number also gathered from the surrounding cities to Jerusalem, bringing sick ones, and those who were troubled by unclean spirits, and they were all healed." 5:17, Acts 5:17 says, "But the high priest rose up, and all those with him, which is the sect of the Sadducees, and they were filled with jealousy, and seized the emissaries, and put them into public jail. But a messenger of Yahuwah opened the prison doors at night, and brought them out, and said, Go and stand in the set-apart place, and speak to the people all the words of this life. And now when they had heard, they went to the set-apart place early in the morning, and were teaching. The high priest came, took counsel together with the elders. They sent to prison, and in verse 23 it says that the messenger returned. It says that the prison was shut, but they were missing the apostles were no longer in there. Acts 5:24 says, "And the high priest and the captain of the set-apart place and the chief priest heard all these words. They were puzzled and wondered what it might be. And then someone came and reported to them, Look, the men whom you put in prison are standing in the set-apart place and teaching the people." So it's a much different setup for the way the apostles came to be in the temple. In the Nazarene Acts, they are fighting against the Kohanim. The Kohanim are in a rage and spitting blood and drool and throwing them into prison like rabid dogs. However, in the Nazarene Acts, you see a more ruly debate. There is a period where there is a little bit of animosity gets stirred up at some of the things that Kepha says, but it's a much different situation. So I guess in a way you almost have to ask yourself, like, what seems like the more reasonable behavior that you would expect out of the high priest? I mean, would you expect them to be throwing people in jail and beating them, or would you expect them to actually want to sit down and reason this thing out? It says, Then the captain went with the officers and brought them not with force, for they feared the people, lest they should be stoned. So here you see the apostles, they have the people on their side. It's the religious establishment is the ones that are their adversary, not the people on the street. Verse 27, it says, And having brought them, they set them down before the council, and the high priest asked them, saying, Did we not strictly command you not to teach in this name? And look, you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching, and intend to bring the blood of this man upon us. So what do you have here? You have the same thing that happened in the book of Acts, in the Nazarene Acts, where you have the high priest warning not to teach in the name of Yeshua. Now it's the same thing that was said to Kepha. The high priest warned Kepha not to speak in the name of Yeshua. So you're back to this same scenario that was happening in the Nazarene Acts. Verse 29 says, Kepha and the other emissaries answered, We have to obey Elohim rather than men. The Elohim of our fathers raised up Yeshua, whom you laid your hands on, hanging him on a timber. Him, a prince and a savior, Elohim has exalted to his right hand to give repentance to Israel and forgiveness of sins. And we are his witnesses to this matter. And so also is the set-apart spirit whom Elohim has given to those who obey him. And those hearing were cut to the heart and took counsel to kill them. So in the same way that Kepha was warned not to teach in this name in the Nazarene Acts, and he responds back that, I have to teach in it, and so forth. You see a similar scenario going on. In the Nazarene Acts, at this point, it's where Gamaliel has to stand up and tell everybody to calm down. Here in verse 34, it says, But a certain one on the council stood up, a Pharisee named Gamaliel, a teacher of the Torah, respected by all the people, and ordered them to put the emissaries outside for a little while, and said to the men of Israel, Take heed to yourself that what you intend to do by these men, for before these days Todah rose up, claiming to be somebody. A number of men, about 400, did join him. He was slain, and all those who obeyed him were dispersed and came to naught. After him, Yahud of Galilee rose up in the days of the census and drew away many people after him. He also perished, and all who obeyed him were scattered. And now I say to you, stay away from these men and leave them alone, because if this plan or this work of men, it shall be overthrown. But if it is of Elohim, you are unable to overthrow it, lest you be found to fight against Elohim. Now, I mentioned earlier that Luke admits that he has sources that he's using to put this narrative together. Now, this verses 35 and 30 through 37, this comes from Josephus. So that was probably for this 3 verses here. This is something he took out of Josephus. It's not in the Nazarene Acts. There is no mention anything about Todah, and there's no mention of Yahud of Galilee. But then he gets back to, and now I say to you, stay away from these men and leave them alone, because this plan is of men, it shall be overthrown. Now that's back to what Gamaliel said in the Nazarene Acts. So it's almost like Luke added in this aside about these other 2 revolutionaries, and then he came back to quoting from the Nazarene Acts. Verse 40, And they heeded his advice, And having called for the emissaries, they beat them and commanded them that they should not speak in the name of Yeshua, and let them go. Then indeed they went rejoicing from the presence of the council, because they were counted worthy to suffer shame for his name. And daily in the set apart place and in every house they did not cease teaching and bringing the good news of Yeshua the Messiah. Now in the Nazarene Acts, this is where they have their ongoing debate still. This is where James is in the temple now at this point. And it says in Acts chapter 6, and the word of Elohim spread, and the number of the taught ones increased greatly in Jerusalem, and a great many of the priests were obedient to the belief. And this is where we have Stephen introduced. It says, and Stephanos, filled with belief and power, did great wonders and signs among the people. But some of those, the so-called congregation of the freemen, who were Cyrenians, Alexandrians, and those from Cilicia and Asia, rose up, disputing with Stephanos. But they were unable to resist the wisdom of the Spirit by which he spoke. Then they instigated men to say, we have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moshe and Elohim. And they stirred up the people and all the elders and the scribes, and they came upon him and seized him and brought him to the council. And from that point forward, you have this kind of unusual situation where Stephen gives a very long, Stephen, who is painted as being a Gentile, gives this really long speech to all these Pharisees and Sadducees about their own history. So, but notice that in verse 7 it says that there were a great many of the priests were obedient to the belief. So here you have, according to the Nazarene Acts, you had all, James was getting ready to start immersing priests in the name of Yeshua when this group comes in, led by the man who is their enemy. Here in Acts, it is referred to as this congregation of the freedmen comes in. And they rose up and were disputing with Stephanos. In the Nazarene Acts, it was the enemy was disputing with James, but they were unable to resist the wisdom and the Spirit. And they instigated men to say they heard him speak blasphemy, and they stirred the people, and the elders and the scribes. Now in the Nazarene Acts it says that the enemy stirred up the people, the elders and the scribes. So now, this man who was the enemy in the Nazarene Acts is now turned into this congregation of the freemen, who's disputing against Stephen instead of James. If we jump forward to Acts 7:55, this is after Stephen tells the Jews their own history. It says, but he, being filled with the set-apart Spirit, looked steadily into heaven and saw the esteem of Elohim and Yeshua standing at the right hand of Elohim. And he said, look, I see the heavens open and the son of Adam standing at the right hand of Elohim. And crying out with a loud voice, they stopped their ears and rushed upon him with one mind and threw him out of the city and stoned him. And the witnesses laid their garments at the feet of a young man named Shaul. And they were stoning Stephanos as he was calling, Master Yahuwah, receive my spirit. And kneeling down, he cried out with a loud voice, Master, do not hold this sin against them. And having said this, he fell asleep. So you see Stephen, he's about to be stoned. He has this vision of Yeshua. He cries out, Master Yeshua, receive my spirit. And he says, Master, do not hold this sin against them. And at that point, he died. Right, Allison's saying that Stephen couldn't have been a Gentile. And, possibly because you have this whole story, like, he's telling, he's giving it, essentially a history lesson to the Pharisees. And I always wondered, what was the purpose of that? And there is actually one mistake in there. He mentions something that would have probably got him laughed out of the room. He says that, let me see if I can find it real quick. He's speaking about the burial place of Abraham. But he mixes up Abraham's burial place with Joseph's. well, I'm not going to take up the presentation looking it up, but he mixes up the burial place of Abraham and Joseph. So instead of the cave of Machpelah, where Abraham was buried, it was, and I can't remember where it was that Joseph was. So it would be like if you were in a room full of, well, it'd be like if you were in a room full of music executives in Nashville, Tennessee, and you were telling them that and Elvis Presley is buried in Knoxville where he is to this day. They would laugh you out of the room because everybody knows that Elvis Presley is buried in Memphis. You know, it's a big tourist attraction. Everybody knows that. Well, it's the same thing here with Stephen. You know, he completely gets this detail wrong, and it appears that a lot of this speech was actually just lifted out of the book of Joshua. Joshua gives a similar speech to all the Israelites. So what purpose it was that the speech of Joshua was put into the mouth of Stephen, I'm not sure. But I think that what happened was I think that in order to cover up the author of Acts, who we generally presume to be Luke, in order to cover up his own embarrassment for the behavior of Saul attacking James, he inserted this story of Stephen. Now, I don't know, you know, Stephen may have been a real person. You know, there could have, because it was a great number of people being attacked and beaten, and so, you know, Stephen could have actually been a real person. That could have really happened to him. But the details of the assault on Stephen, it mirrors the details that we have of the attack on James. Acts 1 says, Acts 8:1 says, Shaul was giving approval to his death, and on that day there was a great persecution against the assembly which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the countries of Yehuda and Shomron, except for the emissaries. And dedicated men buried Stephanos and made great lamentation over him, but Shaul was ravaging the assembly, entering every house and dragging off women. And it also points out that, you know, these dedicated men buried Stephanos. In the Nazarene Acts, it was dedicated men that picked James up and carried him off to safety. Acts 9:1 says, But Shaul, still breathing threats and murder against the taught ones of the master, having come to the high priest, asked from him letters to the congregation of Damascus, so that if he found any who were of the way, whether men or women, to bring them bound to Jerusalem. And it came to be that as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly a light flashed around him from heaven, and he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying, Shaul, Shaul, why do you persecute me? So it's the same, the same thing we had in the recognitions. Both sources say that he came to the high priest. Both said that he went after the congregation in Damascus, and that he was carrying letters from the high priest. So again, why no mention of this attack on James? We have the detail. Now here's the from Eusebius Church History. We have the he says about James. He says James, the brother of the Lord, Yeshua, succeeded to the government of the church in conjunction with the apostles. He had been called the just by all from the time of our Savior to the present day. For there were many that bore the name James. He was holy from his mother's womb. He drank no wine or strong drink, nor did he eat flesh. No razor came upon his head. He did not anoint himself with oil. He did not use a public bath. He alone was permitted to enter the holy place, for he wore no woolen but linen garments, and he was in the habit of entering alone into the temple, and was frequently found on his knees, begging forgiveness for the people, that his knees became hard like those of a camel, in consequence of his constantly bending them in his worship of Elohim, and asking forgiveness for the people. So, we have this description of James where, he mentions that he didn't eat meat. Now, there appears to be this animosity between James and Paul. I know Jackson's pointed out that if you take the book of Galatians and the book of James, there's parallels between these two books. It seems apparent that the book of James was actually written in response to the book of Galatians. Paul will make a statement, then James will answer the statement, and it's in order. There's like 20 different points of congruence between these two letters, where Paul will say something, James will retort. Paul will say something, James will retort. Paul will say something, James will retort. Paul is, he says that people that are weak eat only vegetables, and you shouldn't judge somebody for not eating meat, or because if they do eat meat. But so who is the person that's weak in faith that eats only vegetables? Well, he's talking about James. We also have in the Nazarene Acts, Kepha himself is also a vegetarian. The Ebionites, according to Epiphanius, all the Ebionites were vegetarians. And if the Ebionites themselves claim to be descended from the original apostles, so if the original apostles were all vegetarian, then who was Paul talking about? What was he calling the original apostles? Going on with Eusebius, it says, because of his exceeding great justice, he was called the just, and Oblias, which signifies in Greek bulwark of the people, and justice in accordance with what the prophets declare concerning him. Now some of the 7 sects which existed among the people, and which have been mentioned by me in the memoirs, asked him, what is the gate of Yeshua? And he replied that he is the Savior. On account of these words, some believe that Yeshua is the Messiah, but the sects mentioned above did not believe either in a resurrection or in one was coming to give every man according to his works, but as many believed, did so on account of James. So, incidentally, it's interesting that this phrase, the gate of Yeshua, comes up, because in the War Scroll you also see this the same phraseology, the gate of Yeshua. It says, therefore, when many even of this is still continuing with Eusebius. He says, therefore, when many even of the rulers believed, there was a commotion among the Jews and the scribes and the Pharisees, who said that there was a danger that the whole people would be looking for Yeshua as a Messiah coming. Therefore, in a body to James, they said, we entreat thee, refrain the people, for they are gone astray in regards to Yeshua, as if he were the Messiah. We entreat thee to persuade all that have come to the feast of the Passover concerning Yeshua. For we all have confidence in thee, for we bear thee witness, as do all the people, that thou art just, and thou dost respect persons. Thou dost not respect persons. Do thou therefore persuade the multitude not to be led away concerning Yeshua. So it's at Passover. The scribes and the Pharisees and the priests are coming to James, and they're asking him to address the people and basically deny Yeshua. Deny that Yeshua was the Messiah. And Chad says that Daniel too. He must have been weak in faith. Talking about Daniel's eating only vegetables. And then Eusebius continues, says, for the whole people and all of us also have confidence in thee. So stand therefore upon the pinnacle of the temple, that from that high position thou mayst be clearly seen, and that thy words may be readily heard by all the people, for all the tribes, with the Gentiles also, are come together on account of the Passover. The aforementioned scribes and Pharisees therefore placed James on the pinnacle of the temple, and cried out to him, and said, thou just one, in whom we ought to all have confidence, forasmuch as all the people are led astray after Yeshua the crucified one, declare to us what is the gate of Yeshua. And he answered with a loud voice, why do you ask me concerning Yeshua the Son of Man? He himself sitteth in heaven at the right hand of the great power, and is about to come upon the clouds of heaven. So again, okay, there's the same phrase. What was it that Stephen saw? He saw Yeshua at the right hand of the Father coming in great power on the clouds of heaven. So, James is mentioning this same thing, that they're asking James, they've got him on the pinnacle of the temple, and they're saying, what is this gate of Yeshua? And he's saying, why are you asking me about the Son of Man? He himself sits at the right hand of great power and is about to come on the clouds of heaven. Same phraseology, the same vocabulary there. And it says, and when Many were fully convinced and glorified the testimony of James and said, Hosanna to the Son of David. These same scribes and Pharisees said again to one another, We have done badly in supplying such testimony to Yeshua. But let us go up and throw him down in order that they may be afraid to believe in him. And they cried out, saying, Oh, the just man is also in error. And they fulfilled the scriptures written in Isaiah, Let us take away the just man because he's troublesome to us. Therefore they shall eat the fruit of their doings. So they went up and threw down the just man and said to each other, Let us stone James the just. And they began to stone him, for he was not killed by the fall, but he turned and knelt down and said, I entreat thee, Yahuwah Elohim, our Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So here you have James is now being stoned. The words out of his mouth, forgive them, they don't know what they do. Stephen's being stoned. The words out of his mouth, forgive them, they don't know what they do. And while they were thus stoning him, one of the priests and the sons of Rechab, the sons of the Rechabites, who are mentioned by Jeremiah the prophet, cried out, saying, Cease what ye, the just one prays for you. And one of them, who was a fuller, took the club with which he beat out clothes and struck the just man on the head, and thus he suffered martyrdom. And they buried him on the spot by the temple, and his monument still remains by the temple. He became a true witness, both to Jews and Greeks, that Yeshua is Messiah, and immediately Vespasian besieged them. Okay. So, James cries out, forgive them, they know not what they do. Then you have, in the same way that in the Nazarene Acts, you have the enemy grabbing a club off the altar, a piece of the lumber that they used to burn the sacrifices. So he grabs this piece of wood and strikes James. Then you have this fuller grabbing a piece of a club and hitting James. The son of Rechab of the Rechabites. In another source, it actually says that was Simon Bar Cleopas, who was another one of the Nazarenes, the one that replaced James. And of course, at the end of this, according to Eusebius, immediately after that was when Vespasian besieged the city. In reality, it was a couple of years later, but the people all related the destruction of Jerusalem to the death of James. James was regarded as being this pillar. There was a belief among the Yahudim that there were these pillars that were so righteous that they were able to uphold the people, or in this case, that Jerusalem itself was upheld by the righteousness of James. And when James was killed, the pillar was removed, and that's why Jerusalem was destroyed. So the people, the Jewish people in the first century, they believed that the reason that Jerusalem fell was because of the death of James. It says, These things are related at length by Hegesippus, who is in agreement with Clement. James was so admirable a man and so celebrated among all for his justice that the more sensible even of the Jews were of the opinion that this was the cause of the siege of Jerusalem, which happened to them immediately after the martyrdom, for no other reason than their daring act against him. That's Eusebius, Church History, Book 2, Chapter 23, pages 207 through 209. And a similar, much shorter version is in Josephus' Antiquities, Book 20, Chapter 9, that says, Festus now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road, so he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Yeshua, who is called the Christ, whose name is James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when they had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. But as for those who seemed the most equitable of the citizens, and such as were the most uneasy about the breach of the laws, they disliked what was done. So, in Josephus' version, there was actually a trial before they stoned James. So, what's the difference between Hegesippus and Josephus? Well, Hegesippus' version of the story, it sounds more like, it almost sounds like they took part of the first attack on James in 62 or in 37, and maybe some of the details were gargled about what exactly happened. Now, this Sanhedrin of judges that were gathered together, this was actually done by, it says Albinius, but Albinius was still upon the road. So the Sanhedrin of Judges, it was assembled by Ananias ben Ananias, the son of the high priest, the son of the high priest that was involved in the death of Yeshua. That Ananias or Ananus, he, by order or through the instigation of Agrippa, he assembled the Sanhedrin. As far as we can tell, what was going on was that James, because he was acting as his opposition high priest, like Eusebius mentioned that James was actually able to go into the Holy of Holies. One of the actions that had been undertaken by the priests was that they put up this wall from where Agrippa used to sit in his palace, basically sit out like on the patio, and he would entertain dinner guests by having them sit there and watch the sacrifices in the temple. And so the priests did not like these Gentiles, Herodians and foreign dignitaries sitting up there and watching what was going on in the temple. So they put up this wall to block Agrippa's view. Now, if James was the opposition high priest, then that would mean that James was probably the person that headed up that whole operation. So when Festus died, and Albinius was the replacement Roman leader that was being sent to Jerusalem, so that left Agrippa and Ananus as the two ranking people in Jerusalem. So Agrippa, as far as we can tell, he had Ananias get together the Sanhedrin and try James. So this was the same Agrippa that had Paul in protective custody in his palace. So essentially, what happens is Paul's in protective custody in the palace of Agrippa. I think he was there for like 2 years. Paul goes to Rome. Agrippa then has Ananus kill James, the same Agrippa that had Paul in protective custody. Paul's stepbrother Agrippa II orders James to be killed by Ananus. James is killed, and then according to Josephus, Paul is now back in Jerusalem. It says that Paul and Costobarus, his brother, are in Jerusalem. So, I don't think there's any way to prove that Paul was involved in that, but there's a whole lot of circumstantial evidence that seems to indicate maybe Paul had a hand in the death of James. And it says, here's a quote from Hippolytus. James, the son of Alphaeus, when preaching in Jerusalem, was stoned to death by the Jews and was buried there beside the temple. That's Hippolytus on the 12 apostles of Christ and on the 70 apostles of Christ. Here's one from Jerome. James, who's called the brother of the Lord, surnamed the Just, the son of Joseph by another wife, as some think, but as appears to me, the son of Mary, the sister of the mother of our Lord, of whom John makes mention in his book, after our Lord's passion, at once ordained by the apostles. Bishop of Jerusalem, wrote a single epistle, which is reckoned among the 7 Catholic epistles, and even this is claimed by some to have been published by someone else under his name, and gradually as time went on to have gained authority. So, you see here in this quote from James, now, at this time, the Catholic Church is beginning to, they're wanting to distance Yeshua's family, from Yeshua. James is no longer the darling. Everything needs to be, Peter was the successor to Yeshua. So Jerome now, he's saying that James, who is called the brother of the Lord. Now, there are several times that James is referred to as the brother of Yeshua in the Bible as we have received now, and he's referred to as the brother of Yeshua in the Nazarene Acts. There is no qualification. It's not that he's his stepbrother or that it's his cousin. They just refer to him as Yeshua's brother. But Jerome is even going so far here as to say that he was the son of Mary's sister Mary. So they're saying, so he's trying to say that Mary had a sister named Mary, and that was James's mom, not the same Mary that was Yeshua's mom, if that makes sense. Because that's what people do, is that they name all their children with the same name. And it goes on to say, Hegesippus, who lived near the apostolic age, in his fifth book of his commentaries, writing of James, says, after the apostles, James, the brother of the Lord, surnamed the Just, was made head of the church of Jerusalem. Many indeed are called James. This one was holy from his mother's womb. He drank neither wine nor strong drink, ate no flesh, neither shaved nor anointed himself with ointment or bathed. The bathed is probably referring to the public baths, not to immersion. He alone had the privilege of entering the Holy of Holies, since indeed he did not use woolen vestments but linen, and went alone into the temple and prayed on behalf of the people, insomuch that his knees were reputed to have acquired the hardness of camel's knees. And here we have Clement, Hippolytus, Book 7, as quoted by Eusebius, says, the Lord, after his resurrection, imparted knowledge to James the Just and to John and Peter, and they imparted it to the rest of the apostles, and the rest of the apostles to the 70, of whom Barnabas was one. But there were two Jameses, one is called the Just, who was thrown from the pinnacle of the temple and beaten to death with the club of a fuller, and another who was beheaded. The one that was beheaded would be James, James the brother of John. One final reference from Panarion. This is a work by Epiphanius. It says, since James, who's called the Lord's brother and who was his apostle, was immediately made the first bishop, he was Joseph's son by birth, but was ranked as the Lord's brother because of their upbringing together. For this James was Joseph's son by Joseph's first wife, not by Mary. So again, you see that these Catholic theologians are not wanting to admit that he was actually Yeshua's brother. It says, as I've said in many other places and dealt with more clearly for you, and moreover I find that he was of Davidic descent because being Joseph's son, and that he was born a Nazarite, for he was Joseph's firstborn and thus consecrated. And I have found thus further that he also functioned as high priest in the ancient priesthood, thus he was permitted to enter the Holy of Holies once a year, as Scripture says the law directed the high priest to do. For many before me, Eusebius, Clement, and others have reported this of him. He was allowed to wear the priestly tablet, besides, as the trustworthy authors I mentioned have testified in those same historical writings. So you see this portrayal of James as like an opposition high priest by several different historians. And of course in the Gospel of Thomas it says, the disciples said to Yeshua, we know that you're going to leave us. Who will be our leader? And Yeshua said to them, no matter where you are to go to James the Just, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being. Alright, so basically, I guess what I'm trying to say is I think that, and hopefully I'm proving the point, that I believe that this Nazarene Acts actually was the source that Luke used when he wrote the book of Acts, at least the 4th and 5th chapter. You see the parallels between James and Stephen, Stephen being perhaps a stand-in for James. And that Paul, obviously, who was directly involved in the death of Stephen, he was involved in the attack on James. He himself threw James from the top steps of the temple, breaking at least one of his legs. And then even in Paul's letters, you can see that there's a certain animosity between him and James. Okay, so after the presentation, I'm sitting here listening to the recording, and I'm thinking there's more details I really should have given on some of the things I was talking about. I had a presentation mapped out, but of course people were making comments on the chat room, and so we had other discussions pop up that I wasn't really anticipating. Speaking about Paul's Herodian connections. Okay, now Paul, as near as we can tell, he was the son of Antipater II and Cyprus. and he had a brother named Costobarus and a sister who was also named Cyprus. She was Cyprus the third. Cyprus the second was, of course, the mother of Paul. Now, Paul would have been related to, or actually cousins with, the Aristobulus the fifth. That's who he greets in the household of Aristobulus in Romans 16:10, and then in 16:11 he says, say hello to Herodian, the littlest Herod, who was in Rome. Now he was Herod the fourth, Herod of Calice, and so now Herod the fourth. Now Aristobulus was married to this lady Salome the second. Now Salome the second was the daughter of this Herodias. Now Herodias would have been the wife of Herod, who asked for the head of John the Baptist on the platter, which means Salome would have been the girl that danced for the head of John the Baptist. So the Aristobulus that Paul was, the house of Aristobulus that Paul was sending his greetings to, would have been the husband of the girl that danced for Herod that asked for the head of John the Baptist. If that gives you a connection as to the family ties that Paul has. So I wanted to go over that. Also, I mentioned that after James was attacked and they were carrying him to Damascus, they turned aside near Jericho to go to a couple of tombstones that whitened of themselves as a grave site of some of the brothers, that some of the associates of the Jerusalem assembly. Now, and I mentioned that they probably stopped at Qumran. So there's a connection to that grave site at Qumran that I found really interesting. In Robert Feather's book, The Secret Initiation of Jesus at Qumran, and the Essene Mysteries of John the Baptist, he, in his own investigative research, he runs into a very interesting grave that they dug up at Qumran. Most of the graves at Qumran there was human remains, and they were apparently buried, usually naked, where it was just the body placed in the ground. There was very few items included with any of the bodies. There was one exception, that there was one body that appeared to have actually been buried in a pine box, or in a wooden box. I don't know if it was pine, but he was buried in a wooden box. And that was very unusual. Out of all the graves they excavated, there was only one where the body was in a container. It was in a wooden box, and that seemed to indicate that the body of the person was killed elsewhere, killed somewhere else, or died somewhere else, and then was brought to Qumran. So, the other interesting thing about this body is that this body was missing a head. So this same incident that I was talking about with Salome dancing for the head of John the Baptist, the theory is that this body was actually the body of John the Baptist. And that John the Baptist, when his disciples took away his body, remember they took away his body, it didn't have the head. And they took him away and buried him. And he may have actually been that body discovered at Qumran. Incidentally, the body was exhumed and taken to the museum there in Jerusalem and has since vanished into thin air. Nobody knows where this headless body is, but there's a picture of it in Robert Feather's book, and it's a really interesting read as to his investigation searching out that body. So I found that to be very interesting. Now, about this issue with Paul being referred to as the enemy of the early assembly. There was a article, actually it's a blog, done by Simcha Jacob Vinci. You can find him at Simcha jtv.com. It's a blog, or you can just Google, type into a search machine, Jesus and Paul in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so you should find his blog pretty easily. He last week, or a couple of weeks ago, March 24th, he posted an article in which the title of the article is that Jesus was discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in this fragment, there's a mention of a dove, circumcision, the nail from the cross, the wicked priest. And so Simcha thought that maybe this has something to do with Jesus, or Yeshua. He investigated it a little bit closer, and I'm reading this article. I keep saying Jesus, but but anyway, because that's what the article says. But anyway, so the second to last paragraph, I found it very interesting because he goes to this expert with this text, and basically they're trying to cover up the fact that crucifixion is mentioned in this text that he found. It was 4Q 541, and he asked this guy who's an expert, why are they trying to avoid the fact that it says crucifixion? And he says, well, it seems that this text was written by the followers of Yeshua after the crucifixion. They are telling each other not to focus on the nail and the crucifixion as their enemy does, and not to overly mourn their loss, but rather to focus on the eternal light mentioned at the end of the fragment. So, you see this enemy language again. Don't focus on the death and crucifixion as their enemy does, but focus on the light. In fact, I think you could even say focus on the resurrection. Now, why is that interesting? Well, it's interesting because it's the same cognomen referred to Paul, and in a later posting, a week later, he puts another post on his blog on March 30th, and it says that Yeshua and Paul are found in the Dead Sea Scrolls now. And now and so you can find these articles just, like I said, just type it into Google. But when I read the first article, I thought, that's interesting because if you read Paul's letters, he always focuses on the redemption and the salvation coming through the death of Yeshua, whereas the other disciples and the Gospels themselves focus on his resurrection, being the salvation. So, for the apostles, the significant event was his resurrection. For Paul, his death was what brought the redemption. And so, in this article, he actually he's kind of puzzled that this group that apparently now he's determined is positive toward Yeshua, and they're talking about two different fragments now, but he says it's weird though that the group that is positive to Yeshua, however, seems to be distancing itself from Paul's theology of the nail, i.e. the emphasis on Yeshua's death and resurrection, preferring to focus on Yeshua's teachings. And he says, what does this mean? It means that even though Yeshua and Paul are referred to in the Dead Sea Scrolls, at this point we cannot draw any final conclusions about the theology of these early texts. In any event, one thing is for certain, the Dead Sea Scrolls have had to be revisited and mined for information on the historical Yeshua and theological disputes between the earliest followers. So when you find these two articles, if you Google them, read the last two paragraphs of each one of them, and you'll see that even they have now realized that the enemy is Paul. Like, the enemy that's being written about in these Dead Sea Scrolls is Paul. And of course, Robert Eisenman in his books, he pretty much proves that the righteous teacher spoken about in the Damascus document was James the Just, and this villain that's in the Habakkuk Pesher and the Damascus document, who's referred to as the spouter of lies or the lying boaster, is of course Paul. And not only that, but if you read Paul's epistles, you don't have to read very far to notice that Paul is defending himself against two things. He's constantly defending himself against lying, and he's defending himself against being accused of boasting. So again, you have all these connections with the Dead Sea Scrolls and the early assembly of Yeshua, and I wanted to go ahead and just add this other commentary onto my presentation because I want to make sure we got all the information in there. So thank you for listening, and shalom, good night.